So this week we'll be discussing on the chapter of the um, discipline of service. So before even that, just an announcement. Three ways to give. You know, um, be faithful in your tithing and your offerings. One thing about us as humans, it's in our tendencies to want to hoard things and keep things and try to accumulate as much as we can. And to let go is really an act of faith and trust in the Lord. And it's really saying that, Lord, I trust you with my 90%, that you can do more with 90% than I can do at 100% by myself. So it's really just an act of faith and trust in the Lord and your finances. And it's one of the ways of worship that's not the most exciting, but it's really important to live this out. I'm really excited for the guest speakers that we're going to have on Sunday, April 26th. It's going to be an exciting time. I just want to encourage everyone to share this on their social media. If you could also share this with friends and family, that'll be very helpful. And we also have a bio so that people can get familiar with Nick's background and what he does and the work that he does in Brazil. So I just encourage everyone to participate and letting people know who's coming on that day. So let's get into this chapter, the discipline of service. So prior to even reading this chapter intuitively, I connected the word service with humility, greatness, and leadership. And as we continue to move forward with this teaching, I will further expand and elaborate on that. And these are all the scriptures that are tied to this chapter, and we're not going to go through all the scriptures, but some will be highlighted through this teaching. So leadership is a servantship, and what I want to say is that in 2023, 2024, I was trying to get real serious about self-developing, and I was reading a series of books from Dale Carnegie, Stephen Covey, as well as John Maxwell. And, there was always this underlying theme in reading all these books. So one theme that I kept seeing through reading them was, the concept and the idea of a servant leader. And that's something that, was very foreign to me. Normally in the world system is, about like a pecking order system, top-down leadership. The person on top is normally delegating all the tasks, and it's almost like a taskmaster. And but that's not what Jesus defines as leadership and greatness and serving. So it was through this process that, as I said, that I got familiar with the idea of a servant leader. As well as coming to church and knowing about Jesus. And as I came to know Jesus, this is something that he models better than anyone in the history of the world. So I also wanted to give an example of an investor who I'm pretty fond of and have admiration for. His name is Marcus Lemonis. He is a majority stakeholder of Bed Bath & Beyond. He's invested in several companies, and normally when he invests in these companies, they've had some success, but there's something that's obstructing these companies from accelerating and expanding. And as he gets to know the business and comes into the business and sees the operation and gets familiar with the founders and all the employees within the business, he starts to identify some issues within the business. And the issues within the business are normally rooted in a character flaw. So what really obstructs, people from accelerating, expanding, and moving forward and wanting to have the desires that's in their hearts is the character flaw within them. And what I really admire is that he's a capitalist. He cares about getting a return on his investment, but I also see that he cares about people. And he really there was one episode in which he explained that when you're in the top as a leader, your approach should never be like you feel like you're on top. You should feel like you're on the bottom. The people whom you're responsible for are on top of you, and it's your responsibility to push them up, to call them higher, to see the gold in them, pull it out, right? And he does a really good job at that. And I could see myself maybe 10, 20 years, being in that position. And I also wanted to give another example personally. When I was working in the town of West New York, I began as a student intern 10, 11 years ago. And one day I'm walking into the building after my lunch, and the first thing that you see when you come into City Hall is that there's a booth. And the booth is about 8 feet high. Somebody's inside the booth, and pretty much is like a directory. Will tell people where the departments are. If there's incoming calls, they would, transfer the calls to the appropriate department. But one day I saw the mayor's chief of staff on top of this booth sweeping the roof of that booth. And I was like just perplexed to see that, because that was in the season of my life when I was like, what is this guy even doing? Like, you're the chief of staff. Like, why are you doing this? This is like the job of somebody who's like a maintenance worker. Like, so I just looked at him confused, and I asked him, like, Louis, what are you doing up there sweeping that roof? And his response to me was, Jose, there's not one job that is beneath me. And that really challenged everything within me on what leadership was. And just so happens that 2 administrations later, right, he served under former Mayor Roque. There's been 2 administrations after him, and now he's serving as the business administrator in the town of West New York. So for those who don't know what a business administrator does, they pretty much are like a chief operating officer in a corporate structure. So, God's been real faithful to him, and, he's always been somebody that carried himself with like a sense of humility, and it's not surprising that he's in the position that he's in today. And as I said earlier, when I'm giving these examples, just practical examples, but nobody has ever, modeled it like our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So I just want to leave it with that. And if you want to become great, you must become a servant. So I wanted to put these 2 images side by side, because I feel like the right image of the CEO of Southwest does a really good job demonstrating what the first image says, right? So if you want to become great, you must become a servant. And you see, the CEO of Southwest Airlines, he's, taking the trash, picking up the trash. He's, giving refreshments. He's also gives snacks to those who are onboarding the plane. So, I feel like this is a really good example of, what greatness is, what leadership is. And, in the beginning of the chapter, before I even get to that, and greatness is not defined by the wealth that you accumulate. It's not defined by achievements, accomplishments. It's not defined by the wealth that you accumulate, the investments, your investment portfolio. It's not based on any of that. So Jesus completely redefines what greatness is. And, the chapter begins with, that's an interesting situation that's happening right now, the devil. So the chapter begins with Jesus and his disciples at the Passover feast, and they're all looking at each other. The disciples are looking at each other like knowing that somebody's going to have to wash each other's feet. And the disciples are not really wanting to volunteer to do that, because that is the job to them as the least. And the question that's being posed is that they're thinking to themselves, all right, we're okay with not being the greatest. We just don't want to be the least. And that thought pattern is really highlighting their lack and their insecurities, right? Because they feel like, only one of us can be great. And I don't think that's true. I believe that God designed everybody in humanity to be great, just the way, but not the way that we view greatness, the way that he does, right? We were designed and created to carry God's glory and release that onto the earth. And there's nothing mediocre about doing that and carrying God's glory. So I believe that there's greatness in everyone. God has a purpose, a plan, and a person for every single one of us. So as long as we're in step and in alignment with him, and as long as we put him first before our own desires, then he cares about what we care about. But that situation over there, I don't know what's happening, but So, all right. Yeah, it is. It sounds like my office. So, so with how Jesus redefined greatness was that he got a towel and a basin. He decided to get on his knees, right, and to wash, some grown men dirty feet, right, like dirty feet, right, and none of them wanted to do that because it just looked like, that was the job of the least. Even in that time, first century church, the disciples were not even required to wash their teacher's feet. So for a teacher to come down and wash their disciples' feet, that completely challenged their idea of what greatness is, right? So, and Jesus takes it a step further. That's like, that image also reminds me of like him leaving his throne of glory to like be born in a cradle full of dirt, right? So like, it's like the same image, like, if, the fastest way up is to come down. And that's what Jesus is trying to teach his disciples is that, if you want to, greatness is not defined by elevating yourself, it's about coming low. And, and back to what I was trying to say about greatness of like, their idea that they felt like greatness was limited to like maybe one person or a couple people. And as I said, that's not true. Let me give some practical examples. Let's say in the NBA, right? There's 450 to 550 NBA players. And right now, the greatest player in the league is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. He was the MVP. He may get MVP again this year. But anybody who's playing at that level is great. Like even if you're a role player with limited minutes, like it's just a small pool of people compared to the billions of people in this world who are competing at that level. Yep. You're great. Like, you may not be the greatest in the league, but you're still great. Because if you were to be in the league in Europe or in the league in Asia, you're an all-star caliber player, hands down. And even in the NFL, the greatest player right now is Patrick Mahomes. Anybody who's competing at that level is great, right? So there could be greatness in every single one of us. So to think that greatness is just limited to a couple people, that's just a spirit of lack. There's abundance everywhere, and I believe that's something that we should really be mindful of. And also, this idea challenges disciples because one of the questions that the disciples posed to Jesus was like, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And then what Jesus said was like, he brought a child onto himself, and he said the greatest is like this child. And that was, just completely like, they're like, huh? Like, what do you mean? Because children in the first century church, they had no rights, they had no privileges, they had no authority, they really didn't have anything. They were just beneficiaries of everything that their parents gave them. This is a time when, a society that participated, just like today, in child sacrifice. Right, so it just goes to show, like, where children were in the pecking order, and but the good news is that, God wants us to have that childlike faith, that dependency on Him, because, then we don't have to do it alone, right? Now we have, the Lord with us, and we're depending on Him. He's like, yeah, I got you, my son and daughter. This is not something that you have to do on yourself. Like we no longer have to carry the burden to feel like, this is something that we have to like do on our own. And I just think that's great news that, we don't have to depend on ourselves, that we can just fully depend on our Father in heaven. And and to Him, that's what greatness is. So the chapter also discusses on, true service versus self-righteous service. So true service ministers simply because there is a need, built on caring for the needs of others. Self-righteous service, serving that needs to be seen and affirmed. True service is a lifestyle that is ingrained in pattern of living. Self-righteous service is temporary, functions only when acts of service are being performed. True service heard Jesus command to be a servant to all. Mark 9, verse 35. Self-righteous service chooses whom to serve for personal benefit. So pretty much in true service versus self-righteous service, It's pretty much like, what's the posture of your heart when you are serving? Are you serving with motives? Are you serving with strings attached? Are you serving, to portray or a certain image, to mask who you really are, right? To try to uphold the image of humility, or are you serving motivated by love, being sincere and genuine, right? So it's really like that's really targeting the heart motive as to when we are serving, and we should never serve with thinking that we have something to gain. Like, we should never think of like serving somebody, let's say, has authority and influence, and serve them, thinking like, oh, maybe if I serve this person, I will gain favor and get something in return for that. Then, that's not true service. True service is, when you're just doing something in love with no strings attached. You want to be a blessing, right? And I think that's a question that we should all ask ourselves. What are our true motives when we are serving? This is a house when, people get absorbed into the culture. People naturally serve, and which is a beautiful thing. And I don't see that being an issue, in this house. But it's even beyond the church. How are we serving at home? How are we serving in our workplaces? Is that the same heart attitude everywhere we go, not just within the church? And then there's service and humility. Humility is a virtue that is never gained by seeking it. To think that we have it is evidence that we don't. Humility is only developed through the discipline of service. When we crucify the flesh, we crucify pride and arrogance. Flesh must learn the painful lesson that it has no rights of its own. It is the work of hidden service that will accomplish this self-abasement. So, I recall maybe a couple years ago, we had an event in Rescue. And during Q&A, Brother Roshan asked a question to Pastor, something along the lines like, when will one be ready to like step into ministry? And I recall Pastor answering that question by saying, no, normally a pre-qualifier is that when you feel like you're ready, you're not ready. And when you feel like you're not ready, more than likely you are ready. So, I say that to say that, when you think that you have humility, you more than likely don't have it. It's much better for somebody to say that you're humble than to say that you're humble. And, the greatest accelerator towards humility is through acts of service, through, the day-to-day, trying to find ways to like be helpful, whether, at home, to your wife, vice versa, to husbands, children, if you're single, if you're living with somebody, like whatever it may be, at your workplace, how you're trying to find ways, to serve people, because many times, and also like, let's say there's an opportunity for you to serve, and then all of a sudden and it's within your power to do so. It may be a little bit of an inconvenience, but it's really not going to disrupt your flow, for the most part. And you feel that tug, like, you kind of like, oh, do I really want to do this? You got to check your heart attitude, because, that's something that's being highlighted within you that needs to get addressed. And, also like, back to like motives, like, I'm reminded of like Martha when it comes to like motives. Like, she was serving, she was doing a good thing, but, just because you're doing something that's good, is it the correct motive, right? She was serving from, a place of, wanting to be distracted. She wanted to be hospitable. She was extending hospitality. She was serving Jesus and all of his disciples, but with a different, with not the correct motive. So I just, say that to know that our motives are really important when it comes to service. then these are the ways that we can serve. There's the service of guarding the reputation of others, the service of being served, service of hospitality, the service of listening, the service of bearing the burdens of each other, service of sharing the word of life with one another. So there's the service of guarding each other's the reputation of others. So like, if anybody ever comes to me, and tries to say anything about any one of you, it's important that, I say something on your behalf, that I'll be your biggest advocate, and hopefully that'll be the same thing, right? Like, because that doesn't exist in this house, right? We have, there's a culture of honor, and it's just something that's non-existent at the moment. However, as we grow, we're going to absorb, people who come from the world. And, I think there's a good foundation in here right now that will protect, the reputation of each other. So that's just, it's really important to like, if somebody has an issue with somebody, we should just like, bring it to them. Yep. It's like, or if you don't have the courage to say it to them, like speak to them, like, hey, listen, like so-and-so, like, all right, let's bring it to that person. Let's, have a conversation, because sometimes when we're offended at something, it's normally through misunderstanding. So, all you have to really do is like, just have a conversation, pray it out with the Lord, and be like, Lord, I was offended. And, so that when you come to this person, you're not coming to this person with like a spirit of like anger or frustration or disappointment, sadness, whatever it may be. You've already worked it out, and you'll be able to have a clear mind to have a conversation that could bring forth resolution. Service of being served. So there was an example of Peter. He didn't want to be served by Jesus because Jesus was going to wash his feet. And Peter, crazy Pete, Puerto Rican Pete, was like, nah. He was like, he wanted to, because it really challenged his idea of authority and leadership and greatness. He's like, it looked initially like an act of humility, but what it really was, it was veiled pride. He was like trying to give Jesus the stiff arm. And I'm sure Jesus, while he's doing this, he's so present. I'm sure he already knows how Peter is feeling. He's like, well, you're gonna accept this anyway, because in Peter's mind, right, he gave up everything to follow Jesus. So like for Jesus to come down and like wash wash the disciples' feet was not his worldview on what leadership was and what greatness was. He probably thought like, oh Lord, I'm gonna be in a palace with you, right? And I'm going to have all this wealth, and I'm going to be used as an instrument of justice. And, we're going to take over the earth, and, you're going to rule, and I'm going to be one of your main guys. That's what he thought. I'm sure that's what he thought. He's like, you're going to give me a nice house for my wife, and I'm sure he thought about concubines too. But I know I probably went a little crazy on that. But Puerto Rican Pete. So, yeah, he that really challenged his entire view on what greatness and leadership was. So, we shouldn't stiff arm people when they're trying to serve us. We should just, receive it, with humility. There's a service of hospitality. This is probably one of the services that challenges me the most. Hospitality doesn't have to be just about you inviting people and having to cook up a storm for them to feel welcome. It's just as simple as, just sitting down at the table, being at eye level with them and having a conversation. That's the thing of hospitality. For example, my wife and I, we have a 1-bedroom apartment, and we have my brother-in-law and his wife, they have a 1-bedroom apartment, similar in size. The difference between them and us is that they're very hospitable people. They would host the entire family. And Sorabel has 5 brothers and sisters, including herself. So, and they all have, spouses, and they all have kids, right? So it's a whole group of people. And Sorabel and I would be like, nah, y'all not coming all on the same day. We'll have you in phases, but they have no problem inviting everybody. They do a really good job at making people making people feel at home. And, that's something that I see in them that challenges us, and there's an invitation there. So there's the service of listening. Listening is not passive. Listening is active. So it's not that, when somebody speaks and then you like space out and then you're not hearing what they're saying. Like listening takes a lot of action, and many times, we were listening and then we want to say something in the middle of somebody expressing themselves, and that's very unwise to do. Sometimes people are not looking for your insight or your solution. Sometimes people just want to be heard, right? And if they're inviting your insight and your wisdom and whatever it is, then you can share. Then share it. But listening is something that's really important, and I don't think, especially in this generation, I don't think that's really an attribute that many people carry. The service of bearing the burdens of each other. So, Jesus says that, my burden. So Jesus is the one who he carried the burdens of the entire world. As discussed in the chapter. But yeah, he said that my burden is easy and my yoke is light. So we don't have to feel like we can have compassion for people. We can hear people's burdens without having to feel like we have to carry them ourselves. So, and I know that's difficult because, life be lifing, and then the rigors of life can be a little difficult and it's tough. And the last thing you want to hear sometimes is, somebody else's problems, because you have a lot of problems and you have a lot of things going on in your life. But you don't have to carry the burden of what somebody, woo! You don't really have to carry the burdens of what other people are dealing with and going through. So, there's also the service of sharing the word of life with one another. So, we prophesy in part, to think that we individually can have the full counsel of God is very unwise. It's very foolish to think that. We all need each other. And, whatever it is that the Lord may be revealing to you, it's important to share that. Unless it's something that's only for you, then yeah, then you hold on to that. But if it's something that can be helpful and beneficial to the body, then it's important to release that, because whatever it is that you're revealing can be a key for somebody to break through and get through whatever season that they may be going through. So, I don't think it doesn't matter how far along you are in your faith. If the Lord is revealing something to you that's a benefit to the body, then you should have courage to want to share that with a brother and sister of the faith. So I wanted to give examples of what kingdom greatness is versus the world. So in the kingdom, greatness is servant leadership, humility, dependence on God, welcoming the lowly, compared to what the world considers to be great. Self-serving leadership, pride, self-made, valuing people of status. So, the spirit of pride is something that's real prevalent in this day and age, right? You have that self-made spirit. Everybody talks about them being self-made, and yet they have a successful business and they employ 50 people, but yet they're self-made, right? There's individuals who, say that they're self-made, but yet they have a mother and a father who made them and brought them into this world. So that self-made spirit, it's real arrogance and it's real pride. And so and that's something that's celebrated in this generation. And, it's just very sad to see the condition of, what people are actually believing in this day and age. And then valuing the people of status. So pretty much, you put people who are in a position of authority and influence above anybody else. And, if that's not a good place to be when you're, one thing is as I've grown and moved forward, back then, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I was one of those people that valued just people of status and would treat people who were the janitor, the laborer, as if I would look at them as they were less than. Thank God for the Lord that, now when I see them, I see that, there's value in them. And, I look at them and I see them sweeping the floor. And I'm like, wow, if this person is faithful with their position and what they do, I believe that the Lord is preparing them for something else, right? So like, there's no shame in that. There's no shame in doing the mundane things that people think are insignificant, because they're not insignificant. They are very significant to God, right? Before Joseph, can rule a nation, he had to, he was a slave in Potiphar's house and served him faithfully, right? Before David, was able to defeat Goliath, he, was faithfully serving his father's sheep, and that prepared him for the day of battle. So don't ever think that, the day-to-day mundane stuff is not preparing you for something greater, because the more that you're in servitude of people, it just continuously like rips like your flesh, and it like just does something to your heart. I recall a season that was real difficult in my life, but I was also thankful for that season, because my cousin Will, he gave me an opportunity to work with him in his business at the Parker, and and I was very thankful for that opportunity, and I wanted to see his business grow and succeed. And in that time, I accomplished a few things in my life, a few things that I would think that it would never lead me to having to work and serve tables, right? I did all that I could to not have to do that type of work. But here I am doing that kind of work. And I have to do it with a big smile on my face. I wanted to do it with excellence because I cared about my cousin's business. And there were times that I was serving people whom I knew in the community that were less accomplished, but yet they were doing better than me financially. And that was a real tough pill to swallow. And then I had to like smile, serve them with excellence, and give them the best service that I could. And I really felt that in that season, the Lord was really stripping me from believing like the titles are not important. The accomplishments are not important. You're not who you are based on what you do. You are who you are based on who I say you are.
Good.
It completely changed like my identity. Like my identity is no longer rooted in what I do. It's rooted in who He is in me.
Amen. Good night. Go home. That was beautiful.
So these are some things to remember. Let me catch myself for a second. We must follow Jesus' example of servant leadership. So, Jesus came to this earth not to be served, but to serve us. He modeled that for us. So, we should be living lives of being a servant. One thing I recall one time I asked Pastor for a favor one time, and I asked him for I asked you to get me some fragrances so that I could give that as a gift.
Oh, yeah.
And it wasn't a big deal to him. To me, it was a huge favor. And what he said to me is like, no problem, I'm your servant. So it's like, when you're leading people, it's about serving those whom you're responsible for. And thank God that we have a Father in heaven who serves us and helps us every single day.
Thank you, Lord.
Right? Who like we can invite him in, and then he's it's his pleasure and his delight to want to help us out. It is in God's heart for all his people to be great. Some of us may think, I don't feel great. Well, it doesn't matter what you feel. God thinks you're great. God wants you to be great. So just be in alignment with him and just ask the Lord, what's obstructing me from moving forward in this season? Allow me to hear your voice, highlight the character flaws within me. What are areas in my heart that's obstructing me from wanting to serve your people or to serve within my measure? Because greatness is in serving. Greatness is in coming low. So the posture of our hearts when serving is critical. So are we serving, to from a place of love, sincerity, and being genuine, serving as if, everything, it's a worship unto the Lord? Or are we serving with strings attached? Are we serving with a motive? So I think those are questions that we should ask ourselves anytime we're given the opportunity to serve. What's my motive? And our motive should always be love. It should always be to extend a hand and to be a blessing to those who we can be a blessing to. The discipline of service is the greatest accelerator towards gaining humility. So if you want to gain the virtue of humility, the fastest way to do that is through serving. So, yeah. And this is my question that I wanted to leave with everyone. Which way of service has been the most difficult to practice? So, guarding the reputation of others, service of being served, hospitality, service of listening, the service of bearing the burdens of others, service of sharing the word with others. So, we could separate into groups, men on the right, women on the left, and then we can just dialogue and have this conversation as to this question that's being posed.